This has become more of a juristocracy than a democracy. The role for American Jewish leadership, right, is not to intervene in the guts of constitutional reform in Israel. It's to help diffuse the fire.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. Today, we have an important conversation for you about the debate about judicial reform in Israel. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcast, as well as on YouTube. And I'd also like to let you know that JNS is on Telegram. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content, there by subscribing. And now to today's program. How much interference in its domestic affairs should Israel tolerate from the United States? And what, if anything, can it do about the problem? As Israel debates a legislative program of judicial reform, these questions have ceased to be theoretical. Indeed, any doubts that might have still existed about whether Washington is trying to intervene in Israeli politics were removed this week. Most obvious was the invitation extended to Israeli President Isaac Herzog to visit Washington and address a joint session of Congress. While there is nothing unusual or inappropriate about honoring the head of state of an ally in this way, the purpose of the visit is clear to even those who know little about the U.S.-Israel relationship. That President Joe Biden would choose to invite Herzog, who plays a largely symbolic role in Israeli life, rather than Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the man who actually heads the country's government, is not an accident. It's true that Biden tried to make it seem less insulting by finally calling Netanyahu after several months of silence between them, and issuing an amorphous commitment to meet, though there was no promise of a formal visit to the White House and was, in all likelihood, just about a sit-down at the United Nations in September, when both will be in New York for the meeting of the General Assembly. This was just the latest evidence that the administration is siding with Netanyahu's opponents in the debate about judicial reform. Even in the make-up phone call, Biden still signaled his displeasure with Israel's government by making it clear that the United States opposes efforts to place limits on the unchecked power of the Israeli judiciary, as well as his disapproval of Israel's conduct toward the Palestinians. Behind all this is an implicit threat from the administration to punish Israel in unspecified ways should it fail to do Biden's bidding. Though since the entire thrust of Biden's Middle East policy is to downgrade relations with Israel and those Arab nations who want peace with it, while seeking a rapprochement with Iran and a new, even more dangerous nuclear deal that will enrich and empower that rogue regime, it's hard to imagine what could be worse than that. This is, of course, deeply hypocritical on Washington's part. Americans do not tolerate interference from foreign countries in our domestic affairs. Indeed, the thought that Russia might have engaged in some ineffectual, small-scale interference during the 2016 election in the form of Facebook ads that few Americans even saw set off years of controversy that transfixed American politics and produced the Russia collusion. But Washington has always considered that it has the right to do things that it wouldn't allow to be done to America. That's particularly true for Israel. For decades, the U.S. has never shied away from actions that were intended to influence Israeli elections and policy. That took the forms of blatant interventions in the 1996 Israeli election, for take just one example, in which President Bill Clinton went all out to help Shimon Peres's unsuccessful effort to defeat Netanyahu. President Barack Obama did the same thing and went even further when he openly plotted to help opposition parties topple Netanyahu after his election victory in 2009 and in subsequent years. All those efforts were rooted in a desire to get Israel to make concessions to the Palestinians in the peace process that the majority of the Jewish state's voters thought were misguided, if not suicidal. But what's happened this year is far more egregious than those efforts. Biden and his foreign policy team know that the Palestinians are uninterested in peace on any terms. But what they want is a left-wing government without Netanyahu, not so much as they claim to keep the theoretical idea of a two-state solution that the Palestinians have repeatedly rejected alive, but in order to ensure that Israel won't make too much of a fuss about a new and even more dangerous nuclear deal with Iran that will endanger the West as well as the Jewish state. That's why Biden is doing so much to aid those who oppose judicial reform, so as to preserve the ability of a leftist-dominated court to prevent Netanyahu and the right from governing, no matter how many elections they win. Some justify this by pointing to the large amounts of U.S. aid that Israel gets, putting it in the position of a client state that must do whatever its superpower ally wants it to. But the United States profits immensely from this relationship, too, in many ways, including intelligence sharing and weapons development, and, after all, almost all the U.S. aid money that Israel gets must be spent in the U.S. on arms and munitions made in America. That makes it just as much of an aid package to U.S. manufacturers as it is to Israel. That's the context for the drama in Washington, as good relations with Herzog are being used to justify the attacks on Israel's actual government, even while the increasingly influential progressive wing of Biden's Democratic Party make it clear they see Israel as a racist state. Meanwhile, in Israel, the dramatic fight over judicial reform is demonstrating cultural and social as well as political divisions within the country, with American liberals mimicking the apocalyptic rhetoric of the Israeli opposition about the end of democracy, all the while ignoring the serious implications of framing the debate in this manner and how much it aids those who are opposed to Israel's existence, regardless of how much power its Supreme Court has or who is its prime minister. That's the context for the discussion that is being missed by the media, but which should not be ignored. While Israel has no alternative to its alliance with the U.S., for any number of reasons, if there is anything that Netanyahu should have learned during his years in power, it is that Israel not only has the right to say no to America, but must sometimes do so if it is to preserve both its independence and security. Saying no is hard and will alienate some in the U.S., but not those who care about Israel and value the alliance. And that group, which still comprises the vast majority of Americans, as opposed to the left wing of the Democratic Party that has the whip hand over the Biden administration, is to whom Israel's leaders should make their case. If they do, they'll find that most Americans are still with them. Now, to discuss all of this, we're fortunate to have with us today one of the brightest young minds in Israel, who's working on the issues of law and democracy, as well as someone who understands the complexity of the U.S.-Israel and the diaspora-Israel relationships. Aylana Meisel is the founder of the Law and Liberty Forum, a project of Tikvah Fund Israel dedicated to enriching Israeli discourse on law and democracy through campus debate, scholarly publications, and public events. She was formerly deputy director of Tikvah Fund Israel after working for 7 years in senior roles at Tikvah Fund US. A writer as well as an activist and educator, her work has appeared in outlets including Mosaic Magazine, Commentary Magazine, the Washington Free Beacon, and the Jerusalem Post. Aylana Meisel, welcome to Top Story.
Hi, Jonathan. Great to be here. Thank you.
Aylana, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, especially on a day when I know you're a bit under the weather, but we're going to struggle through. Now, Aylana, you're someone who is not involved in the politics of the debate over judicial reform in Israel, but in promoting a discussion about the ideas that behind them that are driving the discussion. I want to start by asking you to explain to us the issues involved. Americans who read the corporate liberal media and even most of the Israeli media in English are being told that Israelis are fighting about whether or not they want to live in a democracy. Is there any truth to that? And just what would judicial reform of the sort that is being currently debated in the Knesset actually mean for the country?
I think there is truth to that. As with all stories in the Jewish world, it starts either 3,000 or 75 or 30 or 10 or 5 years ago. You can trace it back. And the story in Israel at the structural level is that for the past 30 years, even a bit more, there's been a dramatic increase of judicial activism, and the Israeli court has grown from what was previously a fairly restrained court with fewer powers than it has, into one of the most powerful actors in Israel politically, and certainly one of the most powerful courts in the Western world. And the same could be said also for the Attorney General, who's an important part of the Israeli legal system. And so fundamentally, a lot of policy-making power and a lot of decision-making power that should reside with elected officials has moved ultimately to the court because of a number of changes that were implemented by former Chief Justice Aaron Barak, and then later on his successors. So those include some of the things that the reform is currently trying to address, and many others that the reform doesn't touch. For instance...
So if I can just interrupt you before you do... So basically what you're saying is that what's at stake is democracy, but not what, the sort of the media narrative is. It's not that Netanyahu, the people who are pushing for reform are trying to take Israel from a democracy to an authoritarian state. I think you're arguing that currently Israel isn't as democratic as people think it is.
Well, this is where the part where I try to be understanding of as many sides as possible. I do believe personally that the reforms are aimed at enhancing Israeli democracy, and that Israeli democracy has certain deficits because of what the legal system did, but also because of many structural deficits that have been with us since the formation of the country, and that we're on the road to improving them. But at the same time, there are many other people in the country, albeit what seem to be, in general, a minority of the voters, who believe that they are fighting for democracy. It's a different version of democracy than I believe in. I believe that we first need to have a process in which the will of the people is expressed, okay? And then from there, we can start talking about what sort of society we wish to build. The people engaged in the protests, as far as I understand from the friends that I have there, believe that they're fighting for a very specific vision of society, and they call that democracy. That's why I said it had merit. Obviously, personally, I have a somewhat different view.
Yeah, so they're basically saying, unless their vision of how Israel should be governed from a sort of social, political, level is implemented, it's not a democracy. As the Democratic Party in New York and Tammany Halls used to say, if they don't win, it ain't democratic. But it's not a...
That's been echoing, right? It's been echoing at the level of, we just had, I think in the past few minutes, a breaking story with a number of people on the Air Force reserves saying that they're not going to show up for duty because they don't want to serve a dictatorship. It's been echoing in the academy. Hebrew University the other day just called for an academy-wide strike, both at the level of research and teaching. Certainly the media has been fully on board, echoing the message. The high-tech sector leadership to some degree. So that is certainly the message that's been heard over and over and over. I don't believe it's correct.
So how is the Israeli judicial system different from the way, for example, Americans govern themselves? And to what extent do Israelis, as well as Americans who are viewing these, debates from afar, as well as intervening in them in the form of the Biden administration, how much do they understand those differences?
I don't think the differences are well understood, and it's a question even to what extent Israelis understand the extent to which their system has changed, because this has only recently become an issue, even though it's 30 years old and it's had significant writing within, even legal academia from a nonpartisan and often, more left-wing personalities in their personal lives, at least. So let's start with some of the ways that the Israeli system is different than the American system. One is this is a parliamentary democracy without a written constitution. It's not a system that's built on three co-equal branches. The default balance of powers in a parliamentary system without a written constitution is that the parliament is supreme, and that's a principle on which there was no disagreement at the start of the country. The executive branch is not separately elected. It's something that is a function of who comes into the legislature and who manages to cobble together the largest coalition of at least 61 members.
Yeah, that's a big distinction, because when American courts, whether they're right wing or left wing, no matter who's being the activist, the decisions that they make have to, at least in theory, be rooted in a law, that they're interpreting a law. The Israeli courts basically can do what they want, right? I mean, just as a reasonableness, that's an inherently, arbitrary, very subjective, basis for making any kind of decision, as opposed to law. So this basically makes judges sort of the kings of Israel. They have more power if they wish to exercise it, frankly, than the government. They are the power over the government. Is this debate really so much about the specifics of these issues? And we mentioned reasonableness just to take one. Or do you think it's just as much or even more rooted in cultural, social, and religious divisions in Israeli society as much as anything else?
I think at this point, certainly, it's not about the details, excuse me, because you don't have two sides negotiating, so it's clearly not about the details. There have been repeated attempts to negotiate by members of the coalition, and nobody's really buying. So I think it's the cultural, social, and religious divisions that you're pointing out that are making the difference. And there it's a mix of what seem to be very long simmering tensions. Ultimately, Jews are a tribal people, and there are lots of different kinds of Jews in Israel, and we all have to live under one roof, which is an opportunity and a challenge that we haven't had in about 2,000 years, so we're sorting it through. There's also long-standing political divisions, meaning Bibi's now in his sixth term, love him or hate him. And I think that there's been a decision taken by at least the political leadership involved here that the proper way to approach this is to try to crash the government at all costs. So there is a suspicion toward Haredim that has nothing to do with the politics of the current day, but which is long-standing because they are, on the one hand, a population that almost entirely does not serve in the army, and on the other, does receive substantial support for their communities. There is certainly among the opposition some resentment toward the national religious. The caricature of the national religious is one that I don't particularly believe myself, but the caricature is that they're a bunch of hawkish, messianists that have driven us to settle in Judea and Samaria, and who are sacrificing the security of Israel to their own ideology. And then, of course, there's Bibi himself, where people have been told repeatedly for many years that he's corrupt, that he's divisive, and so on. And I think every political leader will seem divisive to some. As far as corruption, there's been a lot of talk and even prosecution so far, and nothing has come through. I'm a big believer in innocent until proven guilty. But I think if you put all of those things together, then there's been a lot of frustration building for a long time toward various parts of the government, and a lot of distrust. I think that's a lot of the reason why people are out in the streets too, is they believe that if more power moves to, or more properly said, returns to the hands of elected officials, then it will be these people who they don't trust, who have more power to decide how to implement policy and who to hire, rather than the court, which by and large is still more often than not a bastion of the left, the more secular types. So all of those things are coming to bear. And then on top of that, I have to say there's just been a lot of misinformation. And this is something that I lay at the feet, both perhaps more so at the feet of the opposition leaders, but also at the feet of those promoting the reform, even though within that group of people there are good friends. So the misinformation has gotten to some truly atrocious levels. So I've heard that for the lack of reasonableness, the government will be able to now jail all of its political opponents. I've heard that we're headed for a theocracy, right? I've heard that when these reforms are implemented, Bibi will be able to get out of his cases whether or not he's convicted. None of those things is true. In fact, they're patently fantastical. But on the other hand, it's very hard to find a good one-pager, right, on what reasonableness is, why it's a problem, why it needs to change, how these changes are going to work to the benefit of the people. And the same could be said for almost every other reform that's been considered. And so I think that was an oversight. I don't know that it would have changed anything, given the levels of animosity that have now surfaced, and the amount of kind of complicity with even all sorts of lines being crossed. But it's something that they should have really tended to.
Well, this is sort of among those who care about constitutional and legal issues in Israel. The question of what happens with the court and all these various issues has been debated for a while, but it really hasn't been so much, on the top of the Israeli public debate in this way, has it? It's always been security issues, or do you hate Netanyahu or do you love him? It's only really within the last 6 months or 7 months now that judicial reform became the number one issue, and sort of everything that is being said about it is, as you say, it's all hyperbole and apocalyptic rhetoric. I guess, there has been, to a certain degree, a failure to prepare the Israeli public to have a reasonable debate about reasonableness.
I can tell you at least to what my knowledge was done. And I would agree that it was not sufficient to make sure that people, I think a lot of people were pro-reform, right? I don't know that a lot of people understand the details of the reform. And so if your friend who disagrees with you politically says, well, okay, I'm pro-reform too, but reasonableness is going to end us up in a horrible place, and you don't have the tools to explain why that's not true, then your position starts to kind of fall away, and you start to question, and then you see a lot of, again, it's friends and family out of the streets with their vuvuzelas and, banging. Today, there are a bunch of people who went to the Rabbit in Tel Aviv and were banging on the windows. They locked people in. In the initial vote on reasonableness, I believe that there were demonstrators that tried to glue themselves to the doors within Knesset. There's, of course, many more phenomenon that are much more serious in terms of people who are now saying that they're going to refuse to serve and so on. So I think the right believed that they had made their case. One, because there's a huge crisis of public trust in Israeli institutions. It just is. It's within the Knesset itself, with the parties, but also within the legal system. Okay. Now, it's no surprise that the Knesset has something like, I believe in the last survey from the Israel Democracy Institute, 18% public trust. Okay. It's no surprise because at any given point in time, only some of the guys that you voted for are having any substantial effect through politics. It's a coalition system, right? And the same could be said for the parties, which are around 9%. And there I don't justify it, but I can understand why it's low. Also, Israeli political culture is quite rough. But the legal system, the Supreme Court, right, which is supposed to be a neutral arbiter, which is supposed to be an interpreter of law that we can all rely on, no matter what our politics are, as of last year was resting around 42%. And it had experienced a 30% drop in public trust since 1991. There was a study put out by Professor Jonathan Tobin of the Hebrew University and Aaron Garber. Don't remember if it was this year or last year, at the Hebrew University. And the study tracked public trust in the court between the year of 1991 and 2018, comparing the drop in trust also with about 40 other countries that had answered to some international survey. And they found that in Israel, the drop was particularly dramatic, and they managed to isolate out enough factors to correlate it to the growth of judicial activism. So the public trust issue is a big one. And it feels like a lot of people know that there's an issue. Two, there's been talk for more than 6 months about this. There have been attempts to put forth different reform proposals by members of the current opposition. I don't know whether I mentioned it earlier or not. Okay,
yeah, there were people who were for this who are now saying, it's a question of authoritarianism, but they're not for it if Netanyahu is going to be the one who is implementing it.
There were people. I will be as accurate as I can. There were people who were for different reforms. The bundling is a new thing. Excuse me. But there are certainly people who, within the opposition today, who acknowledge the problem and who even campaigned on it in the past, and had even suggested similar things. I believe Gideon Sa'ar, as part of his agreement to go into the Lapid-Bennett government, had made an exploratory committee on a 65-person override clause, part of his deal, for instance. So that was another thing. Then Simcha Rothman, who is one of the leaders of the reform, had also written a book that was a national bestseller on 7 of the most egregious cases of judicial activism in the country. And then, of course, there was this legal platform put out by the National Religious. And so put all of those things together, and one could, I think, rationally come to the conclusion that at the very least, the idea that we had to do something about the legal system was understood. Fine. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people understand all of the specific problems. And to it, the battle today outside of the Knesset is not really about the details at all anymore, because I don't think that people have the tools to discuss it the right way if they want to. And it's also not clear how many people truly want to.
Yeah, I think a lot of the rhetoric that one hears is just about the judicial, as you say, that Israel will become a theocracy, it will become a dictatorship. It's very much divorced from the details of this. I mean, and it's really hard to argue that any of these reforms will lead to any of that. I mean, I think it's impossible to honestly do it. But, on one hand, it seems like it's gaslighting that the side that wants less power for the democratically elected, legislature, is saying that therefore democracy and the other people who want more democracy are against democracy, but they genuinely believe it. It's not like they're, it's like a game they're playing. They really do believe that if they don't stop this, Israel will come apart. And I guess my question is, what is, really the mood in Israel right now? The media certainly, that Americans can read and see are portraying it as something approaching a civil war or a nation at standstill with the legal, academic, business, and even security establishments and other liberal elites at odds with other Israelis. But is the country really falling apart in this way? And, what will be the consequences if, some or all of these reforms are passed? Will the whole thing just blow up?
I will say two things before I answer that. One is that I want to stress that all of this is my personal opinion, not that of my organization. And two is that I'm not a prophet, so I don't actually know. I think one of the real dangers right now is that the laws do pass, and then they're challenged in the court, and then the court strikes them. Okay, and then what happens? I don't know what to tell you, but at the same time,
I mean, what it's sort of like if the legislature reforms the judiciary and the judiciary doesn't want to be reformed. There was a famous case in American history where the Supreme Court in the late 1820s or early 1830s ruled against then President Andrew Jackson. And, Andrew Jackson just said, the court can rule whatever it wants. I'm going to do what I want. And he did what he wanted. He wanted to throw the Native Americans, the Indians, out of Georgia and some other southern states and move them all the way to the west, the famous Trail of Tears. Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. He did it anyway. But this would be the reverse. The legislative and the executive branches, which are joined, make a decision, and the court says, sorry, we're still in charge.
Right. It would be the branch without the person, the sword, suddenly maybe having a sword. Look, I truthfully, I don't want to speculate on it because things develop at such a fantastic rate here, and they're so complex, and there's a lot of activity behind closed doors that I don't know exactly what way the politics of it turns. What I will say is that I think the vast majority of Israelis want some kind of productive discussion, if possible. And that regardless of what happens at the political level, we all live together, we all have to fight together, we all have to thrive together. And I think that's just going to be the mentality of most of the public. All of the stuff that's being portrayed on the media is troubling. It's extremely troubling, especially because the media is giving it a really, heavy helping hand as well. But at the end of the day, we all have our friends, we all have our families, we all have our homes, we all have our jobs. And at least in the places that are not, that are not being, I'd say, politicized or militarized for the benefit of a specific political cause. I think we're all here to support each other and just keep going. It's kind of an amorphous answer, I know, but I truly believe in the goodness of the Israeli people, and this does not affect it.
Well, that's an optimistic interpretation, but from your perspective, as someone who's lived in both Israel and the U.S., ties in both countries, do you feel that this is an issue that is really exacerbating the ties between Israel and the diaspora, as well as those between the United States and Israel? Or are the problems afflicting both those relationships much bigger than just judicial reform, even though right now it seems as if judicial reform is something that is, on the tip of everyone's tongue as a great divider?
Yeah, no, it reminds me of how we all turned into baby virologists when COVID broke out, and suddenly everybody had an opinion on epidemiology, and a vociferous one too. You're basically asking the same question that you did earlier about, is this about the specifics or is it about the cultural, social, religious tension? And the answer is also going to be the same, which is to say, I find it hard to believe that judicial reform is the thing that sparked real tensions. I think that it's a function of mistrust of the current government, partially because there are certain policies that certain parts of the diaspora Jewish community would like to see advanced here, particularly, let's say, with respect to recognition of reform conversions, let's say, right, that have placed it truly at odds with a more traditional government. And so they don't want that government to have more power. I think that people have been imbibing a more left-wing narrative on Bibi for a long time and see it as, again, it's the corruption narrative, it's time to go narrative. Although I have to say, Ehud Barak was investigated for corruption as well. Ehud Olmert was even served jail time, and for some reason, that hasn't seemed to leave a lasting impression as to their bona fides. In fact, they are quite involved in the protest movement, promoting
Barak especially,
yeah, especially,
and helping to fund it. Yes,
of course, but all in the name of rule of law, democracy, and decency. And so, I mean, there's kind of a perfect storm where you have you've had tensions based on a differing value set. You've had for a long time discussion about how younger Jews are less, I don't know if the word is committed to Israel per se, or if they're less emotionally connected in a certain way than their parents were. I don't want to disparage. And this is another aspect of it. But I think that there are also some other parts that Israelis, at least Israelis on the right, often overlook. So one is, once again, there wasn't a great explanation of this, even in Hebrew, but certainly in English. And one of the reasons for that, outside of, I think, just a miscalculation, is that you simply have fewer people on the right here who speak, elegant academic English. And fewer people on the right here are involved in academia. Academia is, especially in the humanities, overwhelmingly politically to the left, which is one of the reasons why you have the universities now threatening to shut down for the nth time. And the same could be said, at the very least, for certain members of the high-tech sector that are coming out of certain army units where they're known to have somewhat more left-wing leanings, even though, I have to say, it certainly doesn't affect their stellar service to the IDF. And those connections are really bearing fruit, right? You've had mass letters protesting Israel from people that certainly didn't know about constitutional reform or any of the issues behind it only a few months back. You've had the narratives in the Hebrew press parroted out to English language press, and certainly even in the Israeli English language press, the Times of Israel has been, I think, a particularly partisan source on this issue. And so there are a lot of things affecting the American perception of all of these things, including, of course, the lack of knowledge on the differences between Israel and America and in the government and the constitutional history. There are many, many different factors involved here. And once again, the message to stress there is that the role for American Jewish leadership, right, is not to intervene in the guts of constitutional reform in Israel. It's to help diffuse the fire. It's to help make sure that we remain a people that can talk to each other. Okay, it's to help ensure that Israel remains strong, safe, flourishing, and free. And it's to engage in whatever discussions they want to with different leadership in Israel to make their voice heard, because obviously every Jew has some stake and some voice in Israel. But taking a political side here, especially a side that is at the moment promoting, what's it called? Yemei HaShibush. I'm forgetting the language in English. But promoting actual days where they go and days of disruption, where they go and they try to make life hard for civilians.
Not so civil disobedience.
Yes, exactly. It's not, first of all, not a great look for American Jewish leadership to sort of be on that side instead of suggesting that it should be denigrated and stopped. But secondly, again, their role is to try to make sure that the state of Israel is supported, the people of Israel is supported, and the majority of people in Israel voted for this government, whether you like it or not. If you if you dismiss what this government
delegitimize, quite frankly.
Delegitimize is a better word. If you delegitimize this as simple, insert the bad word, tyranny, theocracy, you're effectively dismissing the majority of Israeli voters. And that's not what American Jewish leadership should be doing. They should be coming with extended hands to learn about this from all sides and to try to explain it in the most rational and calm way to people who are concerned in the states.
Do you worry that some of these, that this debate, which is, as we just agreed, is about delegitimizing the democratically elected government of Israel functionally, that it's leaching into other debates about the legitimacy of Israel itself at a time when there is increasing anti-Zionist activism in the United States as well as around the world, increasing support for BDS and sort of anti-Semitic boycotts, at a time when, there are major political factions in the United States, including, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, the Progressive Caucus, the chairman of the Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives just called Israel a racist state and then took it back, but then took back the walk back, that this is having an impact on that debate and undermining the cause of Israel itself, and helping those who don't really care how much power Israel's Supreme Court has or who is the Prime Minister of Israel, but are just against Israel itself.
I would agree with everything you just said, Jonathan. It was a good question. No, that to me, that's very clearly true. It's been a concern since the start of the campaign against the reform, but also truly against the government. As you know, it was not just confined to the political level. You had high-tech leaders going to investors abroad and telling them to withdraw funds from Israel. Israel was going to turn into tyranny. It was not safe to invest here. Of course, a lot of them moved their money to SVB.
Yes. Be careful what you wish for. Yeah.
It was something of a misjudgment on their part. No, certainly, look, one of the key planks of support for Israel for a long time within the American pro-Israel community has been that Israel is a liberal democracy that shares American values, and it's something that we can all be proud of. Well, the people who oppose reform, right, one of the core planks of their argument is Israeli democracy is in danger, and the people in government are not liberal Democrats, and they're trying to turn this place into Hungary and Poland. Okay, fine. I don't agree with any of that. But parodying that message across the world attacks what has been a core idea that's brought a lot of people closer to Israel for a very long time. So that's clearly extremely problematic. It certainly feeds into the BDS narrative in my view. And, I think in a way, it's also something that made explaining this very difficult for the right. Why? Because each side is trying to explain that there's a democratic deficit, or will be. Meaning, one side is saying, if the reform goes through, there will be a democratic deficit. This place won't be a democracy. It's going to discriminate against, pick your minority of choice. Okay? Whereas the case of the right at this point is that, as you mentioned earlier, right, this has become more of a juristocracy than a democracy. There are democratic deficits that need to be resolved. Okay, well, that's effectively kind of almost saying the same thing. It's saying it somewhat differently. And so it's a message that needs to be negotiated very gently and very delicately, which goes back to what I was saying earlier. The role for Americans, for American Jews, if they really care about this issue and if they really care about the state of Israel, is to try to get deep into the details and to talk to as many people as they can and to ensure that the conversation keeps up and not this kind of like loud, raucous argument and even lawlessness that's been happening here.
Let's, move this to a more granular level about the debate about ideas as opposed to the politics and the, sort of apocalyptic rhetoric in the streets. Tell us about what Tikvah Fund specifically, is trying to do in Israel, and what sort of impact do you think it's having? And do you feel more Israelis, especially in the legal field, which is where you are listening to the ideas it is promoting about, sort of the rule of law and democracy? And what impact can this have on the country's future if these ideas flourish?
A tremendous one. So the Tikvah Fund is an organization that is devoted to cultivating Jewish conservative leadership, or in Israel, specifically Israeli and conservative leadership. And we define conservative as the economic political thought, strategic political thought, free market ideas, kind of a sober realpolitik approach to foreign policy, more unapologetic, even Jabotinsky take on Zionism. And then when it comes to law, which is the project that I specifically head, the Israel Law and Liberty Forum, we're promoting the separation of powers, judicial restraint, individual liberty, and limited government, and doing so by offering different platforms for scholarship and debate. Now, the reason that Tikvah is doing all of this is because many of these ideas are only slowly coming into Israeli discourse now. They're only slowly taking root now. As you mentioned earlier in the interview, I think, for many years, the discourse in Israel was very security-focused for what I think are obvious reasons. Maybe in the past decade, there's been more discussion of economics. Certainly, cost of living issues have become very, very big. Housing, affordability has become very big. But by and large, the institutions, the culture-forming institutions within Israel were set up by its old left, and they've maintained the intellectual legacy that they were endowed with. And they haven't left a lot of room, at least in these different fields, for a diversity of thought or for conservative perspectives, classical liberal perspectives. The texts and the ideas that really built the most successful societies in the Western world are not often studied here. One of the things that we like to say is Adam Smith was not fully translated into Hebrew, for instance. To take a more contemporary thinker, my project, along with Shibboleth Library, which is a Tikvah Fund publishing arm, put out a collection of writings by Justice Antonin Scalia in Hebrew, explaining different ideas there and how they might relate or not relate to the Israeli landscape. This is not something studied in Israeli university. And whether it's through the seminars that we offer, which are anything from a couple of weeks and intensive weeks in my department, or year-long seminars for economics, economic thought study, strategy, and I believe also Zionism. We're offering people an opportunity at a really intellectually formative stage, often students, to encounter these ideas and think about how they want to integrate them into their future careers. And very often we work with people that are aiming toward some aspect of the bureaucracy of politics, of academia, of journalism, all these different sectors of intellectual influence and social influence in society. And over the past 10 years, certainly Tikvah's had many alumni that have risen to different, I'd say, influential positions within all those different fields. My own project, which I started 4 years ago, which deals specifically in the field of Israeli law, still has many young alumni, but some have clerked on the court. Many are at the top firms in Israel, they've gone into the public sector. And what we do is we offer them a different set of ideas that speak to their instincts, to which they don't necessarily have a language to articulate. And we empower them to go and represent those ideas in their respective environments. And hopefully, at some point, they will be able to also advance them. So that's the role that we've had in Israel. And when I mentioned it, I said that there would be tremendous impact. I think that this point in Israeli society is showing to what degree that there's a certain, I want to say this with affection and love for Israeli society, but there is a certain elite that's been trained by largely homogenous universities that's taken up positions in various important parts of Israeli society. And you can see that you can have a 64-person government, which is trying to advance a policy and not even a particularly grandiose one, let's say, when you're talking about the reasonableness one, where you'll have the health union threatening to go on strike, and the academy threatening to go on strike, and members of the military suggesting that they won't show up for reserve duty and so on. Okay, and I think one of the important things that we do is that we're offering people the tools, right, to express a different set of ideas as they rise, hopefully, into those same places, and to at the very least diversify the conversation and make sure that all of Israel is represented and not just one particular part of it.
I think that's very important work, and the fact that you and some of your colleagues who have been promoting these ideas have come under fire from sort of the hard left and sort of the elite establishment shows that you're having an impact. Thank you so much for what you do and for all your insights that you gave us today. And anyone who wants to learn more about the Tikvah Fund can go to tikvahfund.org to learn more about it, as well as to get a menu of essays and podcasts. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you're thinking. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.